I was adopted from Seoul, Korea, in 1978.
Sure. My name is Daniel Yoon. I was adopted when I was 5 months old.
I was adopted in 1972 from South Korea, and I was sent to an American family.
It all started with the Korean War, known as the first major conflict of the Cold War. When fighting broke out in 1950, North Korea had the backing of China and the Soviet Union, while South Korea was supported by the UN, led by the US. The war left a massive number of children without parents, especially among those born to foreign soldiers and South Korean women. As South Korea grappled with tough economic conditions, many were put in orphanages and eventually adopted by families in the US and across Europe. Since the 1950s, it's estimated that over 200,000 South Korean children have been adopted abroad, around 150,000 of them by American families. Today, we share the stories of just 5 of those adopted children. Many of these adoptions happened because the children's fathers were soldiers from Western countries. Dr. Kim Park Nelson from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Minnesota says that the separation of children from their families due to war is a painful reality of both World War II and the Korean War. At the time, South Korea's discriminatory attitudes toward mixed-race children born to foreign soldiers also played a big role in these adoptions.
Because Korea was so racist that they felt like there's no way these children can be in Korea, right? And now we see all kinds of multicultural marriages.
Over time, to ease the burden of being a post-war country, South Korea sent the orphaned children abroad for adoption instead of investing in their care. Eventually, many orphans were sent overseas, regardless of whether they were mixed race or not.
And I think sometimes we think of it just from a South Korean perspective, like there was poverty, it was war, they didn't want these mixed race children.
For adult adoptees trying to find their birth parents, it's hard to get accurate information, leaving most unsure of where to even start. The first place they turn to is the paperwork from their adoption process, but there are major discrepancies between the documents prepared in South Korea and the English records kept in the US. Park Nelson points out that, especially in the post-war years, there wasn't enough time to properly verify information of orphaned children who were quickly sent abroad.
My Korean mother went and sat at the orphanage and cried until they would tell her where we were. So they gave her the address just to get rid of her. My sister was also sent with me as an orphan with orphan papers. On these papers, we have no family. We were sisters, but on paper, and we're sent together, but in order to facilitate adoption, they have to break all family ties. And he said, in Muslim countries, we don't have this international adoption thing. I was like, how is that? You're lying, no way, like everybody has that. So I looked it up on the US Department of State, and indeed, there isn't that. There isn't this mass, and like what's happening in Gaza right now. People are not mass adopting these orphans, right? And I got to know more about it, and I found out that there's other ways to care for children.
My file, when I looked at my adoption file, it said that my mom, my birth mother in Korea, she found out she was pregnant after my birth father and her broke up. They weren't married, and she was young, educated, she, was poor, and so she just figured it would be best to give me up. So I kind of just knew that. That's just the story that was in my record for like 40 something years. But yeah, the whole story was completely fabricated. And the person at the agency told me that it was because they had to write a story that made it believable, or not believable, but made it a story that made it sound like I needed to be adopted, that I was abandoned. So that's why they did that back then. I decided to do a birth search, and I found my birth family, and it was totally the opposite of what my original paperwork said. I actually had a full family.
Sure. So the first file I got when I was about 18 was basically a photocopy, I think, that was emailed. And so there were post-its, or at least blank spots or redacted portions of it. It was both in Korean, and there was a translated version And then, curious me, I took the Korean version and tried to translate it separately to make sure that it matched up. And I think there were some very small differences, nothing that was huge. But when I went in person to see the physical file, it looked very similar to what was photocopied. But there was like maybe at least 1 to 2 to 3 pages that were not in the photocopy, and still made me question how much of this is real, true, and imagined. It feels a little imposterish. It feels a little bit like I've lost something I can never get back. I've connected with adoptees who have met their biological families, and what they share with me, or what resonates with me, is that it still feels like overwhelming sense of loss, because there's nothing that can kind of replace the years that they've missed.
Those who can't find their biological families struggle with the emotional toll of the search, while for those who do, the real challenge begins after the reunion. Growing up in a completely different society, many adoptees find it hard to overcome cultural and language barriers, which can lead to frustration, anger, deep depression, and anxiety.
And so it's a very present reality for us today. And there's a lot of anger, confusion, and frustration around why this is so difficult and why our documents are either mishandled or misplaced or sometimes outright changed. I think it's difficult for a lot of people psychologically. If I had to guess, I would say yes. I could imagine it really exacerbating any sort of especially if you don't have a support system when you're searching, or you find out something very distressing and you're searching, or there's so many barriers to the search. I can imagine that really exacerbating feelings of anxiety and depression.
Park Nelson notes that the South Korean government and adoption agencies have tended to avoid weighing in publicly on the consequences of this policy. She points to the difficulty of fully integrating in a country where you're not a citizen and where you didn't grow up.
So they're willing to do all kinds of bad paperwork just so we have the opportunity to be adopted, because they thought that that was good for us.
My parents were told to assimilate us to the American culture, to their culture. So I grew up kind of identifying more as Italian, because my dad's Italian, my mom's German, Irish.
Sending children abroad for adoption, once viewed as an economic and political necessity by past generations, has now become a problem for their descendants.
I don't think any of our parents, our adoptive parents, would have adopted us knowing we had a full family in Korea, So, yeah. So everything was wrong.
South Korea's adopted children, who do not hold U.S. citizenship, now face the threat of deportation. Some who want to return to their country of birth are denied entry.
I do know, the Korean government has rejected some people who they've tried to deport to Korea, that has said no. But I do know that we help a couple adoptees who Korea has said no to. So they're just here, but they're stateless.
But the U.S. and South Korea maintain that the adoption process was safe, ethical, legal, and transparent, with measures to protect both the children and their families.
One of the parents had to be, and they also had to come to Korea and stay there for a while to learn a little bit about the culture. And so that they would, be able to have that experience to share, with the adoptee.
Well, I'm not integrated. I just live here. So I live here as a foreigner. So I don't really belong anywhere.